Welcome back, and now we move on to the figure of Demeter to wrap up Chapter 5, the chapter on Greek goddess mythology. I'd like you at this point to pause your video and turn once again to your Harris-Platzner textbook. Please turn to page 156 at the end of Chapter 5 of your Harris-Platzner textbook, which is the Homeric hymn to Demeter. Please pause your video and open to page 156 of your Harris-Platzner textbook. Okay, are you there? Okay, so I'm going to give you some background on Demeter, and then there are some things that I'm going to talk about regarding the hymn itself. So Demeter is the goddess of agriculture, as you're very familiar. In the Roman mythology, she's the one known as Ceres, C-E-R-E-S. It is from her that we get our words cereal in English, derived from grain. So agriculture is a relatively advanced concept for the Greeks, because the ability to grow crops out of the earth, just like also raising vines and making wine, which we'll see later with Dionysus, both of those involve using plants to be able to support not only oneself but also potentially one's family and then one's clan and maybe eventually an entire city. And so that as we discussed in a previous video, is going to be considered more civilized than animal types of agriculture, like with sheep and so forth. Okay, so Demeter is in charge of all this. Now, Demeter is one of the earlier Olympian gods. She's, in fact, one of the sisters of Zeus. It's a curious thing that she actually appears to have had an incestuous relationship with Zeus at one point, and that was where another god referred to as Iacchus apparently came from. So interestingly, even Demeter herself was not completely devoid of the incestuous type of relationships that happen a lot with the Olympian figures, as we'll again talk about more in a later video. But okay, Demeter is associated with agriculture, and for that reason, she's one of the most maternal of all the gods. She herself has a daughter, Persephone, and Persephone also is offspring from Zeus. So again, we have this incestuous relationship between Zeus and Demeter, producing the figure of Persephone. Now, the issue comes up with the marriage of Persephone. Now, marriage in the ancient Greek world was almost invariably arranged, with very little say on the subject from the bride-to-be. And that's what's going to happen here with Persephone. So, the issue that comes up here is that in the original division of the world, after the defeat of the Titans among the big three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, lots were drawn as to who was going to get what. Not surprisingly, Zeus was the one who organized the lots, and Zeus was the one who got the best lot, being in charge of Mount Olympus. Poseidon got the sea, which was sort of midway, not too bad, but he was always rather grumpy about getting only the sea. And Hades was the worst off down in the underworld, and therefore the most rejected of all the gods. He didn't even really have a proper seat on Mount Olympus as a consequence of his being always in the underworld. So, as compensation for that misfortune for Hades, Zeus agrees to provide him with a bride. And the bride chosen for him is Zeus's own daughter, Persephone. Again, emphasizing all of this inbreeding that's going on with this family. All right, so now Hades breaks up from the underworld long enough to catch Persephone as she is with a group of maidens picking flowers. Hopefully you got the point here that flower picking is associated with virginity and maidenhood, like the word flower often does in English. So when Persephone is grabbed and brought down into the underworld, she is in effect losing her virginity, losing her status as a maiden. That's why she drops all the flowers. And she immediately is going to become Hades' wife. Now, this is a big deal with not only marriage, but with general Greek civilization, about the fact that a woman goes from being a young girl to a maiden ready to be married, and then eventually becomes a wife or a matron as a married woman. Essentially, all those phases of life are considered to be terminated when the next one begins. So it's almost as if this woman, first girl and then later woman, dies and is reborn on each of these different cases. So when Persephone goes down into the underworld to become Hades' wife, it really is as if she dies as a maiden and becomes then, by force of course, the wife of Hades. I'm going to come back to that in a minute because of course there's something in the story about this. But there are depictions on some Greek vases of a satyr, S-A-T-Y-R, that's one of the half-man, half-goat worshippers of Dionysus, pushing a woman, a beautiful young lady, on a swing, going back and forth. Now, it looks like it's just play, but some scholars believe, however, that this swinging of the woman is actually her transition from being in one phase of life when she's not married into her new phase of life when she will be married. And so effectively, she is dying at the point when she gets married. She's died and reborn as a wife. And of course, many people, both then and now, would consider marriage to be like death anyway, so it fits. So when later on when you read Homer's Odyssey, you will see that when when Odysseus' son Telemachus is going to punish all of these servant girls and in Odysseus' palace, the ones who were unfaithful to Odysseus and slept with all these suitors that invade the palace. First, he's going to kill them by sword, but then he decides instead to take them into the courtyard and hang them all. And there's a description of the swinging bodies as they are dead, but the swinging also catches the idea that they theoretically could have gotten married to these men that they were sleeping with, and of course that never happened. Instead, they got married to death. In like manner, Iphigenia, the daughter of Agamemnon, who is sacrificed to give Agamemnon free passage by sailing to Troy, is described as being married to death. She's taken to the altar under the false pretense that she will be married, and when she gets there, she's in fact just surprised and shocked to discover that she's actually going to be married to death. So once again, marriage can be related to death in that way. That's all described, by the way, in the beginning of Aeschylus' tragic play Agamemnon that we'll be reading later in the course. All right, so Persephone, therefore, crosses the threshold down into the underworld. It might be of interest for you to know, by the way, that in a marriage today that we think of in which the husband takes his new bride across the threshold, it's usually nowadays thought of as an act of tenderness, bringing her into the new home. But in fact, that was originally an act of savagery. That was in fact the new husband grabbing and capturing his new wife to bring her forcibly into their new home and their new life together. So that's essentially what Hades here is doing to Persephone, taking her forcibly across a threshold from the above world into the netherworld, from life to death, from maidenhood to married life, down into the netherworld to become his bride. Well, not surprisingly, Demeter, the mother, has an absolute fit about this. She interviews everybody that she can find, Helios, the sun god, Hecate, to find out what exactly happened. And everybody agrees with her that it was too bad that this happened, but they seem to in fact think of this as a natural part of life, surprisingly. Nobody, of course, wants to challenge the great Zeus, and the idea that Persephone has effectively been raped here is, surprisingly, even for Demeter herself, is oddly never really brought up, the injustice perpetrated against Persephone herself. So there's almost a sense of acceptance and commonality behind that particular act, and that probably does reflect Greek civilization accurately in the day. All right, well, Demeter now refuses to provide agricultural assistance to mankind, and mankind almost dies. She travels to the city of Eleusis, and she becomes disguised as an old woman, and she tries to become a nursemaid for that particular son of the princess Metaneira. And unfortunately, that goes badly, because when she becomes this girl's son's nursemaid, she tries to make this son immortal, maybe as a way of replacing her own lost child. And she does that by placing him on the fire every night. The problem with that is that one night one of the servant girls sees this and reports this to Metaneira, and then Metaneira on the next night comes and spies on Demeter doing this, trying to help out the boy Demophon, and she shrieks, raises the roof. Demeter grabs the child and throws the child violently on the ground, throws off her disguise, reveals that she was actually the goddess Demeter all along, castigates the humans for being unable to recognize her as the goddess, despite the fact that the point of her disguise was so that she would not be recognized as a goddess. Okay. And she flies off in a rage. And she thereafter compels the Eleusinians to build a special temple for her and to set up a special rite for her. We're going to come up with later discussion. Because we still, of course, have to resolve the problem of Persephone. Obviously, it didn't work out at Eleusis, and Demeter now is even more in an enraged and grieved state. So mankind is going to die. And of course, that means that mankind won't be able to give sacrifices in accordance with that botched arrangement that we talked about before with Prometheus. So Zeus finally realizes, okay, it's time to get Persephone back out. It's not going to work out. So Hermes goes down into the underworld to get Persephone back out from Hades. However, somehow in the course of Hermes' arrival to get Persephone out, Hades is able to trick Persephone into eating a pomegranate seed. The pomegranate is one of the fruits of fertility. And so it's significant that it's that particular fruit whose seed Persephone eats. But in fact, anything that she'd consumed down in the underworld would make her permanently part of the underworld. And that's one reason why when the souls of the dead came down into the underworld, that they drink from the river Lethe. Not only is Lethe the river of forgetfulness, so that they forget their past life, but also drinking means that they are now stuck down in the underworld. That's essentially the bond that they create. So Persephone is now bound to the underworld, and yet if she stays down there permanently, Demeter will kill all of mankind by refusing to allow them agriculture. So this is the crisis that we get into. She does get back up to see Demeter, and Demeter, after embracing her, realizes that she's actually violated that rule about the underworld, and Zeus can't change that. So we end up with an interesting compromise. We have Persephone spending half of the year with her mother Demeter in the above world. That represents spring and summer, the pleasant time of year. And then she descends down into the underworld and becomes Hades' wife again. And during that period, then we get fall and winter with the earth suffering cold temperatures and no fertility. That's when Demeter is sad. And that is therefore an explanation, according to nature myth, from chapter 2, of the seasons. Now, once this arrangement is made, and Demeter is satisfied with the arrangement, she then teaches her son Triptolemus, another son of hers, to then in turn teach mankind how to carry out agriculture on their own. And that way they will no longer be dependent on Demeter herself, so there won't be any further incidents involving Demeter's temper tantrums that lead to the near death of mankind altogether. And so that's the civilizing effect of Demeter's agricultural teaching that we have at the end of this hymn to Demeter. And that once again demonstrates how the gods up on Mount Olympus gradually remove themselves from direct intercourse with humans. They now deal with humans specifically as with intermediaries, such as Triptolemus in this case, rather than dealing with them one by one. But because we have this worship formed of Demeter as the mother goddess, we also have the worship of Persephone as her daughter, and the two of them are often described as the two, or even the twain, you could say in English. The two goddesses who are worshipped together, the goddess of the seed, that's Persephone, and the goddess of the harvest, that's Demeter. The idea is that Persephone goes down into the earth as the seed, and then emerges from earth as the full-grown crops, which then grow and prosper and eventually lead to a bountiful harvest, but then eventually die off. And so Persephone's own cycle of life and death and renewal, of going down into the underworld and then returning and then having to go back down again, that cycle is reflected in the seasonal cycle as well as in the plantation harvest cycle of planting the seeds, seeing the crops grow, harvesting the crops, and then having to cut them down once they die, and then replanting them again the following year. And so the whole idea of cyclicality, in this case with the women's side of life, is what Demeter represents. So essentially the great goddess fertility concept from the Eastern world, reflected in Gaia, the mother goddess, and Hecate, the other Eastern goddess, supreme. All of that now comes much more locally from mankind. Mankind now has to take his own role in perpetuating that cycle by planting crops himself. Just like, remember, in Adam and Eve, Adam himself had to learn how to grow crops himself on earth. He couldn't just rely on the tree of life to just grab it. He had to learn how to civilize himself and raise himself and his subsequent generations by growing things. So once again, what we see with Greek mythology is that it's really less about the actual gods and a lot more about the human condition, how it grows and evolves and continues to be subordinate to and dependent on the gods. But the gods don't come in and interfere with human affairs directly. Instead, the humans eventually have to learn how to support themselves. Okay, and so that concludes this series of videos on chapters 3, 4, and 5, separated in the summer course or all together in one session in the school year course. And in the next chapter that we will come to in a later video is chapter 6, describing the full Olympic pantheon. We'll see you next video.